As many of you know, in the decades after the Second World War, the psychoanalyst Margaret Mitscherlich formulated the very provocative thesis that German society, in the aftermath of the defeat of Nazism, the destruction of Germany, while it was enthralled in economic reconstruction and the so-called Vergangenheitsbewältigung, that German post-war society was afflicted by what she called the incapacity of mourning, die Unfähigkeit zu trauern. And Mitscherlich's thesis, which is very famous among my Germanist friends, etc., was really shaped to formulate the failure at the collective level, the political level, but also the individual level in German culture, with the failure to mourn and deal with the true sense of the catastrophe, the event that in a sense was not over after 1945, precisely because there was the incapacity of mourning and the separation from Deutschland über alles, and not just the Nazi period, but the whole legacy of Germany. And this notion, a similar thesis, is formulated by Sebald in his book or essay Luftkrieg und Literatur, where he also fails German literary imagination and fiction writers of the 50s and 60s for failing to deal with the massive destruction of German cities and loss of civilian life in the Allied bombing campaign. I'd like to propose that there's a similar kind of thinking about historical events in terms of the problem of the incapacity of mourning that one finds in a very different historical context in Toni Morrison's Beloved. Just to remind you, the figure of Beloved, this spectral figure that returns, is a figure precisely of what is not carried in the memory of the world, which is the 6 million and more, the dead of the Middle Passage. And this sense of void and incapacity of mourning, which is what afflicts American culture even still today. And in Toni Morrison's novel, you remember that all the characters who project their own melancholic interpretations onto the beloved, is it the daughter who was killed, etc., so Paul, Lady, and Seth, those are all melancholic projections which really attest to the incapacity of mourning. So all of this is really just to propose the idea to think historical events in terms of the incapacity of mourning. And here, this incapacity to mourn, I'd like to propose just as a figure of thinking, always obviously in a very specific historical and cultural context. I don't want to equivocate. But I'd just like to propose that this is a way to formulate the idea of the unthinkability of an event. So it's something that already came up, that what we are witnessing today under various signifiers, which are really placeholders for something to understand, Anthropocene, etc. They're all attest to we find ourselves in a kind of unthinkable situation. And this unthinkability of historical events is something which, just to give another anchoring for that, the Haitian philosopher, historian, he's actually an anthropologist by training, Michel Rudolph-Trouillot argues in his really amazing book called Silencing the Past, Power and Production of History, where he argues very briefly that if you look at the most progressive and advanced anti-slavery abolitionist literature in the French context in the 18th century, so Diderot and Abbé Raynal, that though they are very supportive of the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint Louverture, etc., fundamentally the event remains fundamentally unthinkable for them. So even though they're clearly on the side of abolition, emancipation, Trouillot proposes this idea that history is produced around silences, around what he calls unthinkability, and here he draws explicitly from Pierre Bourdieu, that the unthinkable is that which one cannot conceive within a range of possible alternatives. One can't even conceive of the very terms in which to make sense of the problem. And here Trouillot is very clear. His argument is not that Diderot should have been able to think the event. It's that whatever he does think about the event is structured by fundamental unthinkability of the event. And so I'd like to just propose that every age is, in a sense, marked or caught in the unthinkability of its own event that it's, in a sense, witnessing but failing to give an adequate testimony to. And I'd like to propose to really think about this through the problem of mourning. So unthinkability as the incapacity of mourning. The reason why I want to set it up this way, because you might say, what does this have to do with anything at all, let alone plastics, is that I could imagine that centuries from now, future Penn State whoever is here, if anything at all. Of course, football will still be here, but future historians or future, conferences at the Rock Ethics, et cetera, will sort of look back to the 20th century and 21st century, and for them, what will define the unthinkable for them about us is maybe not necessarily the wars that we're perpetuating now, but that what we have done to the planet. That much in the same way that we look back to history when we narrate the history of traumatic events of the 18th and 19th century, generally speaking, of course this is changing, we focus on wars, Holocaust, genocide, et cetera. This is not to minimize those events, but it could be that future historians, for them, the real center of gravity of our age, what defines our unthinkability, is the planetary destruction and waste, just to give it a very large thing. Such that, in a sense, the question is then, for them, what defines us is our inability to think through what we are doing to the world and the planet. And indeed, a few days ago, I read in The Guardian a really interesting article called "Flight Shame is Dead, Concern Grows Over Climate Impact of Tourism," about how air travel and tourism has boomed over the past years, in a sense, basically shredding and throwing into the garbage can, so to speak, any optimistic targets for the slowing down of carbon production through air travel. Mintotas yesterday mentioned his own air, though you got on the plane, again, I don't want to shame you into it, it said, X thousand, tons of carbon. So this article was about how, in a sense, even though there's all this public talk and airlines are, we're going to reduce carbon. Actually, the opposite is happening, almost a kind of manic tourism at the moment where the world that we want to visit is being destroyed. It's kind of a manic reaction to the self-perpetuation of destruction. So what I'd like to propose, again, this is kind of hopefully not too long-winded, is if indeed we accept the thesis that the Anthropocene is really a signifier that more than anything else tells us that we are in the midst of something unthinkable. Of course, we are here gathered in this workshop over the past 2 days to somehow think through the unthinkable. And that I'd like to reformulate this in terms of the threefold problem of mourning, melancholia, and manic. And think about, in a sense, the unthinkability as caught between trying to navigate, are we trying to mourn for what's happening? Are we melancholic? Are we manic? And more specifically with regard to trash, and more specifically with regard to plastic. So that's just the structure of the approach. And here, the idea is that the seemingly innocuous water bottle that we all use every day, we've often used this as an example, Ted's water bottle. In a sense, when we throw it away, this is something that Mintotas, we sort of use the object, we throw it away, and the act of throwing away is an act of forgetting. And it's kind of an unthinking act of forgetting, which, as you know, there's been a lot of very interesting studies. Guy Hawkins has a great essay on the idea of made to waste, the idea that we produce all of these objects, packaging, et cetera, that are explicitly made to be thrown away and disposed. So like a plastic bag that we use every day at the store, it's a kind of transient object. We use it once, it passes through our life world, and it sort of fades away. We throw it away thinking now it's over and done with, without realizing that it has an afterlife. So the act of throwing away is a kind of symbolic death. It's interesting that I researched the history of the trash can, because I wanted to know when was the trash can invented. And it turns out that in French, the word for trash can is poubelle. Poubelle was the name of the guy, Eugène Poubelle, who introduced the trash can. He was a minister of sanitation in the 1860s, 1870s in Paris, because before that, trash was picked up by rag pickers, like if you read Dickens, or in French, chiffonnier. Baudelaire has poems about it, etc. And when the trash can was introduced, the idea was bien jeté, c'est bien oublié. So, throwing away, it's difficult, throwing away well or doing good by throwing away is to do good by forgetting. So there's something about the trash can or the burial of nuclear waste is itself the container in which we forget. So in that sense, there's a kind of unthinkingness to this is a part of the unthinkability, and more, if you wish, conceptually, it's unthinkable. So to be a bit more concrete, what does it mean to say we are experiencing an event that is unthinkable, not in an abstract sense of just we don't have the categories, but every day we are performing something which we cannot think through. It's unthinkable precisely in the way that Gunther Anders argued for especially nuclear weapons, et cetera, but what he calls apocalyptic blindness, that somehow blindness is constitutive of the form of life that we have. And here, I'm just putting some large markers. This is a new way to think about what Mark Fisher called capitalist realism, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is a world in which we use plastic things. So I would like to formulate the idea of plastic realism, plastic capitalist realism, because precisely, and this is what Guy Hawkins and Max Liborian and others in discard studies have rightly emphasized, trash is just not an economic object or utilitarian object, it's structured to a form of life. So you have to change our form of life, and of course, this is exactly what we're not able to do. So this is a sense of the unthinkability. If this is true, so this is an accurate description, then the unthinkability of our planetary destruction, just put it in those terms, means that our attempt to think this unthinkable event is always à venir, it's still to come. And in that case, then it's always too late. Because if the thinkability, if what marks our thinking is the unthinkability and the unthinkability that we could live otherwise, then whatever thinking we have about this unthinkable problem is always going to arrive too late. Or it's going, so either it's too late and therefore it's a kind of melancholia that we're suffering from, or it's the frenzy of manic activity. We have to have more conferences, more philosophy conferences at Penn State, more publications, that somehow the more we're going to think about it, that somehow the more we're going to be on time. But of course, if it's fundamentally unthinkable, then it's going to miss the mark. So either it's too late or it misses the mark. This, you might say, is the opposite of Hegel. So it's not that philosophy comes at the end. Philosophy comes at the end and is always missing the mark and too late. So what I'd like to sort of propose, again, this is just to set things up, is how can we somehow think the unthinkable caught between melancholia and manic, too late or missing the mark. And specifically, I want to ask a question which would seem absolutely unthinkable for us. Is it possible to mourn trash? Can we mourn trash? Which seems to be an absolutely ridiculous, unthinkable question. And so let's imagine that we received a message in a bottle from somewhere unknown. In the internet age, it's going to be a film. So I'm going to show you the first few minutes of a film, an amazing film by an American-Iranian filmmaker. The film is called Plastic Bag. I'm just going to show you the first minute or two, and everything that I'm going to do is just inserting itself in this film. The film is 15 minutes long. It's available on YouTube. And then at the end of my comments, I'll just show you the last bit. So in a sense, everything I'm going to do now is, let's imagine we received a message in a bottle, a kind of emergency, right? And this message in the bottle is a film. And so I'm going to show you the first minute or two, and then I'm going to sort of comment on it in order to ask the question, which I think this film is asking: can we mourn the death of a plastic bag? The death of a plastic bag that will live forever, or at least live 10,000 years.
They told me it's out there, the Pacific vortex, paradise. You may be thinking, hey, shut up and enjoy the sunset, you idiot. Well, I don't care what you think. No one needs me here anymore, not even my maker. Do you know her by chance? Have you seen her? My first breath. I met my maker. I had a purpose. She was quick to accept me into her home and make me part of her life. But she also gave me my independence. I met her friends. She trusted me. She showed me what she knew of the world. I didn't understand all her running around, but I always cheered her on. This was shocking. This brought me closer to her than ever before. My skin against her skin, my cold, her warmth. I made her happy and she made me happy. I thought we would be together forever.
With these opening words, voiced by the inimitable, obviously, Werner Herzog, the protagonist of Ramin Brahami's short plastic film begins to tell their life story, the story of a plastic bag. Brahani's short film opens with a setting that most of us has likely seen before at the beach without ever thinking much of it, other than that slight annoyance of having our romantic stroll momentarily spoiled, without ever thinking perhaps that it's the bag who is imploring us to look at them, rather than us looking away in concern only for our own well-being. For how many discarded things do we daily chance upon without too much ado? At the beginning of the film, we see a crumpled plastic bag on the empty beach, to echo Rilke, we might say, waiting to be heard among the hierarchies of the angels. No one needs me anymore, not even my maker, the plastic bag laments. Theirs was a story that began in a grocery store when a woman plucked a plastic bag from the dispenser at a checkout counter that miraculously brought the plastic bag to life with the touch of her hand, much as God's finger sparked life into Adam in Michelangelo's fresco in the Sistine Chapel. Quote, I met my maker, I had purpose, the plastic bag recalls. Brought home with her groceries, the plastic bag enters into the routine of this woman's mundane life. The bag finds not only purpose in the purposefulness of the woman's activities, but attains an intimate perspective within a life world in which they apparently now play an indispensable role. As the plastic bag remembers, quote, she was quick to accept me into home and make me part of her life, end of quote. The bag feels a sense of companionship with the woman, holding her tennis balls, carrying her lunch to work, and in an unsuspected moment of closeness, indeed intimacy, facilitating the application of ice on the woman's ankle sprain after she has played tennis. Quote, I met her friend, she trusted me, the bag explains. Throughout these recollections, there's an unmistakable tone of unrequited love. When the plastic bag feels meaningfully to participate in and hence belong to the woman's form of life, the woman, however, remains entirely anonymous. Indeed, we are never shown her face, let alone confided with her name, and have almost nothing of who she is other than the rough rudiments of a typical middle-class woman. Brahani's film, I think, really presents us with an inverted image, so it's philosophy, as Hegel would say, die verkehrte Welt, inverted image of the world as we know it. For who has ever wondered about the lives of plastic bags, or for that matter, bottles, from the unspoken vantage point of what we take for granted about the practice of our lives, from the negligible without which much of how we live would in fact not be feasible? Who has ever considered that a plastic bag would call on thinking, philosophical or otherwise? And yet, what stories would we be able to live, going shopping, playing tennis, taking lunch to work, etc., without these ubiquitous, translucent carriers of all those things, without which we could not so easily lead our lives? Practically invisible and symbolically unremarkable, plastic bags, bottles, boxes, etc., are entrusted to protect our valuable goods, allow for the transportability of items, and generally facilitate the containing and carrying of things, the containing, indeed, and carrying of our lives. What would we do, indeed, who would we be without the things that we carry? In thinking about and considering those iconic artifacts, which are often seen to express what makes us human, any number of candidates have been proposed. In Stanley Kubrick's 2001 Space Odyssey, it was a bone transformed into an instrument of killing that, in a miraculous leap of evolution, elevated us for humanity. For Georges Bataille, it was the parietal images in caves in Lascaux that announced the dawn of human consciousness and the separation of human life from animal life. For many paleontologists, knapp flint instruments or perforated ornamental shells symbolically express the human, or that first articulation of the human. But as the anthropologist Elizabeth Fisher proposed, we should look instead to the fabrication of containers, whether slings, pouches, or net containers, with which to transport and store things as that artifact that essentially expressed the advent of the human in early hominid cultures, and indeed that launched the adventure called humanity. The invention of things with or in which other things can be carried or stored gives, of course, further heft to André Leroy-Gourhan's influential argument that the anatomical development of bipedalism and erect posture freed the hands and the mouth, and thus allowed for the incremental enlargement of the hominid brain, the enhancement of cognitive facilities and tools and language. Of course, there's a famous argument by André Leroy-Gourhan. The human is the tool-making and speaking animal. The tools that we make shape our cognitive abilities. Now, on Fisher's conjecture, it's more than just the hand axes, knapped flints, and spear points that reveal who we are. What really reveals who we are is that our early ancestors could carry things in things called bags and pouches, etc. And as the science fiction writer Ursula Le Guin remarks, quote, "The invention of the vessel broke open time and space. Once our ancestors could place items they might need later in the bag, they could satisfy their hunger when and whenever they chose," end of quote. So with this capacity to carry and contain things, elements of the river, the forest, animals, etc., became transportable, space became less finite, humans were able to have things on demand, and thus were able to satisfy their needs and demands, hunger or thirst, for example, on their time, thus allowing the mediation of desire through the storage and portability of goods. And Le Guin further argues, quote, "This shift was the prelude to the development of culture itself." This is in her essay, the Cultural Theory Bag of Fiction. This is her quote, "Our enhanced talent for subsistence provided a secure source of energy to support the massive outlay required to hunt large prey, and from these adventures, stories emerge." It's also a theory of narrative itself. Stories which are another kind of vessel, and indeed culture is a kind of vessel itself. It's a kind of structure of memory of the past. In what Le Guin calls the carrier bag theory of fiction, containers in their literal sense, carrying things, as well as in their figurative sense, culture as such, and narratives, form the narratives and hence culture that support and sustain human existence across generations. Now, in Brahani's film, after having enjoyed a home in the world, and this is, you'd have to see the rest of the film, the woman makes one final use of the bag to dispose the waste of the dog. Dog goes to the bathroom, the woman takes the plastic bag, puts the dog poop in it, and throws the bag out. The plastic bag then starts to recount their bewilderment and sense of betrayal at this disposal, at this summary execution. The bag wonders, as the bag is put in the trash truck and going to the dump, you hear Herzog, the bag, wondering whether the woman is worried about its well-being. Does the woman notice that I've been taken away? And whether the woman expresses concern, and indeed the bag expresses concern for whether the woman is concerned about what is happening to the bag. The woman, remember, remains forever out of sight, and indeed the act of throwing trash away is an act of forgetting, for things we are never mindful or memorable of to begin with. Castaway and homeless, this is the rest of the film narrative, the plastic bag is then caught by a gust of wind. It's displaced from the trash dump, and it waywardly wanders across different landscapes until it arrives at the deserted beach with which the film begins. Thus bringing you back to the opening shot of the film. The first lines of the film, you heard it, "They told me it's out there, the Pacific vortex paradise." In the final chapter of the life story of this plastic bag, which is the end of the film, the plastic bag is drawn out into the sea and finds itself entangled in the great Pacific garbage patch. A murky plastic soup of fishing nets, bottles, bags, toys, and other plastic garbage and microplastics, etc. The great Pacific patch is neither paradise nor purgatory. It's what I would call planetary Hades. That is both a kind of great outdoors, almost in the Mei Suan sense, it's the great outdoors, out there far removed for us, spatially and ontologically removed out there in the Pacific, but symbolically also beyond our awareness, and yet intimately in us, insofar we would not be able to have the form of life that we have without the unthinkingness of using plastic bags and plastic bottles every day. So what I'd like to propose in the last few remarks here is to take seriously this plastic bag in this message in the bottle of the film, that this plastic bag is posing for us, among other things, the question of whether we are able to mourn for it. Because mourning is fundamentally the dealing with the separation of loss. So we throw the bag away, we throw garbage away. This is a kind of separation. And we seem to be fundamentally unable to lament the fact and mourn for what is happening to the plastic bag. And this film, I think, is a kind of elegy. It's a kind of elegy for not the death of the plastic bag, who cannot die and cannot find a place to rest. And of course, this is precisely the figure of the ghost. This is the sense in which plastic bags are ghosts. They fleet through our lives without us seeing it. They go somewhere, but they always return. They always come back to haunt us. So I'd like to really take seriously, not just in a metaphorical sense, but take seriously the question, can we mourn for the plastic bag such that the plastic bag finally comes to rest and is no longer out there as a ghost in the ocean, which again, I understand is a purely speculative question. It's a fictional question, and indeed it is an unthinkable question. It is fundamentally an unthinkable question. The way I want to do this is going to be twofold, and again, this is really just a speculative gesture. I'm going to try to find a way to make sense of what it is to think of the bag as something that, not what we look at it, but it sort of looks at us in such a way that it makes a demand on us that sort of sort of centralizes us from our own sense of being in the world. And then I will use a kind of folklore and science fiction to understand what would it mean for the bag to make a demand and be in the quest for a proper death. I will use basically 2 or 3 references. One is a tradition in medieval Japan of broken utensils that are discarded but that continue to haunt the living as demons. I will look at that tradition. I'll show you the image. So again, I'm going to try to find resources to make sense of how broken things and discarded things can haunt us as ghosts. First in folklore, and then I will turn to 2 science fiction novels, recent science fiction novels by Chinese and Taiwanese authors. One is The Man with Compound Eyes, which is by Taiwanese. Another one is Waste Tide by contemporary Chinese, because as you may know, Chinese now, as you know, Chinese science fiction is one of the most cutting-edge science fiction. And one of the themes that's now being developed, I mean, Taiwan is not China, I know it's very complicated, but it's in Chinese, is what I would call sort of gothic trash horror science fiction novels, which is a kind of new genre. So I'm going to, almost like Bloch, I'm going to look at fairy tales and science fiction to think the unthinkable, if you wish. And again, so first let me motivate what would it mean to say that, to in a sense, to allow this silence of the bag to speak and make a claim on us. Here, it's quite amazing that if you remember in Lacan's 4 fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, Lacan has this amazing and very Lacanian kind of idiosyncratic little story he tells about going with a fisherman in the Sea of Brittany and seeing a sardine can, a piece of trash that's floating in the ocean, if you're familiar with the 4 concepts. He uses this to give an explanation of what he means the objet petit a. I'm not so interested in what he means by the objet petit a. I find it really striking that, in a sense, almost in a very psychoanalytic point of view, there's a kind of unconscious of trash that he sort of that we can sort of read. So let me talk about this really amazing little story that he gives, because the way in which he understands this encounter with the piece of floating trash in the ocean, the sardine can that's floating, which he uses to understand the objet petit a, is a way, I think, to understand what it would mean to allow the piece of trash, whether it's the sardine can or the plastic bag, to speak for itself and make a demand on us that dispossesses us of our own attempt to master and dominate it. So here the basic story is, and if you remember, go look, it's a very funny story, how Lacan talks about how one day he's in Brittany and he goes with a fisherman, a local rustic fisherman called Petit Jean, and he's going out in the boat, and all of a sudden the fisherman points at this piece of trash that's floating in the English Channel off of Brittany and says to Lacan, do you see this sardine can glimmering? Guess what? It doesn't see you, is what he says. Lacan then uses this and talks about how when that was said, he felt somehow completely a kind of disjunction, because he felt that when Petit Jean was saying, do you see this? It doesn't see you, that's how he experienced the uncanny effect of being alienated from his own perception through the gaze of the can, which is the objet petit a. What that means is that the can, the sardine can, is a gaze that I don't recognize myself as being seen by the can. It displaces and decenters me from the frame of my own seeing, in Lacan's terminology. So for Lacan, as Lacan develops this, the idea is that we encounter this object that produces an uncanny effect of, in a sense, removing us from the center of frame of our own perception, and disassociates what we project to be the object, our representation of it, in Lacan's thinking, our image of it, from the object as what Lacan calls das Ding, the thing. And the thing is precisely that which we don't see, precisely because of how we do see things, but which in certain moments of cracking up, to use it undoes, and as Lacan says, it puts me out of the frame. So here, Mintotas used the example, or talked about how in the Guy Hawkins book, he speaks about how so much of disposal of trash is constituting our mastery and dominion over things. The fact that we can put it in the right place, etc. I read this Lacanian story as a way to think about this object speaking to us is das Ding, because it's forcing us to encounter the object not as we project it, as a piece of trash that is lifeless, but as making a kind of ethical demand on us. And that ethical demand is, you cannot mourn for me. And because you cannot mourn for me, I cannot die. So this is the way in which this idea of how to think of this plastic bag as beyond the system of symbolization in which we constitute mastery over the world. And so much of, as you know, the management of trash is about affirming the mastery, that somehow trash is a problem for which there's a rational solution of management. So that's the way in which to then ask the question, or take the question seriously, what would it mean for this object to return as the thing that we cannot identify, the thing that sort of haunts us, the thing that needs to be laid to rest because it's a kind of disturbance, and we are, in a sense, under its demand, if you wish, to put it that way. So this is the way in which I want to talk about, in folklore, in Japanese folklore, this genre of illustration, which again, I obviously don't know Japanese, but there's a term for it. It goes back to the 14th century. It's, in Japanese, it's tsugugomagami, which means discarded tools or artifacts that, because they are unhappy at having been thrown away, become transformed into demons that come back as vengeful spirits in order to haunt the living. And this is an illustration from a 14th century scroll. And if we talked about Miyazaki, if you're familiar with Miyazaki, Miyazaki draws from this tradition. The suit sprites in Miyazaki and things like that. So it's a very long Japanese tradition. And here the idea is that these objects survive and have a kind of afterlife for hundreds of years, being discarded. So it becomes trash and waste. And they change it into semi-animate beings that then return and look for revenge precisely because they feel that they haven't been properly respected and properly laid to rest. So in a sense, they are a kind of ghost. They're a yukai, which is a figure of ghost in Japanese culture. And as far as I can tell, doing the research that I've done, obviously in English language, scholars and historians don't really understand why in them. So scholars seem to be very perplexed about how this tradition, how this iconography emerged, partly because a lot of this material is visual without explanatory text. So I also find it interesting that cultural historians don't really understand how this tradition developed. There's different theories, etc. And the idea is that, again, these objects take offense, not at the fact that they are no longer of use, but they haven't been properly laid to rest. So it's not that they're upset because they're broken. They're broken, but they haven't been properly laid to rest. In a sense, there was no funerary service for these objects. And in very high-valued objects like samurai sword, katana swords, etc., warriors would bury their swords. There would be a funeral service, etc. And this, at least in the Shinto, it's complicated, it's kind of a Shinto Buddhist worldview that most likely underlies this idea, is the notion, the Buddhist notion of what is called pratya samapada, which is the dependent interbeing co-origination of all things. So there is a very complex sort of Buddhist structure of thinking behind it. I won't go into it, but basically the idea is that objects like living beings are also in a relationship of dependent co-origination and conditionality, and therefore deserve respect when they are being laid to rest, much as other forms of life, even though it's clear that it's not life and it's not simply the projection of life. It's what in the Japanese tradition they have kami, it's called kami. So here, I'd like to sort of, almost like Ernst Bloch, folklore gives us a way to think about trash as making a demand for a proper ritual of mourning and a proper rite of burial, a proper rite of passage other than throwing it away and making it a problem of recycling, et cetera, et cetera. The other two examples, and again, I'll be very brief just for the interest of time, is the two novels, Waist Tide and The Man with Compound Eyes, and I won't go too much into them. And there the idea that the novel Waist Tide is about an island called Silicon Island, which is set in the near future in China, based on actual places in China, where electronic trash of the world, your broken computers, et cetera, are brought to this island, and there's a kind of e-waste proletariat that has to go through it and try to recycle and remanage all of these materials. So the interesting thing here is that the production of trash is not only just the items that are being sent in a way where we don't remember, but they are also colonizing and producing a new class of eco-trash population. So the novel is about migrant e-waste workers that are on this island, and very quickly the main character is a young girl who becomes infected by a strange virus as she's taking apart these mechanized robots and prosthetic devices. She becomes infected. It gets a bit complicated. Her spirit then dies and mutates and enters into the body of a discarded tech robot, a prosthetic, melds with it, that changes her sort of consciousness, and then she has a double life existence. She jumps back into the human body. She wakes up as two people, but she becomes a kind of hybrid machine. And then she leads tries to rise a kind of revolution or resistance against the companies that are managing this. So here the idea is that when we throw things away, we're not just throwing objects that end up in the Pacific, they're ending up in Indonesia, in India, and it's producing a new class of what Max Liborian calls colonialism of pollution populations that are meant to task to build, and these are sort of like ghost populations. We don't think about them, we don't read about them, etc. And in The Waist Tide, that novel is trying to think about how to transform this proletariat, he doesn't use the term, but this sort of new oppressed class of e-waste workers into a kind of political force. So again, they're making a demand on the living. And this is a political social demand, not for burial, but for genuine life. The second novel, Man with the Compound Eyes, it's a Taiwanese author, And there, and it's another really complex and interesting novel. It's a novel about a woman set on an island. It's Taiwan, but it's not named Taiwan, who is undergoing a mourning process. She's lost her husband and son. And there's a parallel story of an indigenous peoples on another island where part of this indigenous people, they have a ritual where the second son of every family has to undergo a kind of purification, travel into the ocean as a solemn offering to the sea gods, and that's part of their indigenous worldview. They have to go this travel into the sea in order to then to return, and that's the cyclical relationship between the earth sage and the sea sage. And what happens in this novel is this one individual, his name is Ateli, from this indigenous tribe, who undergoes this rite of passage, which is part of the relationship, the symbiotic relationship between the sea and the island. He gets stuck in a plastic vortex, the plastic trash. So he gets stranded without knowing it, not knowing where he is, on the plastic vortex. And then in the novel, a tornado comes and brings this plastic vortex, and it crashes into the island of Taiwan. And here, again, I always like to talk about literature, not to tell you the whole plot, because I want you to read the books. There's also a really complex idea of the impact of waste on indigenous populations, especially in the Pacific Islands. I mean, here he's thinking about Pacific Islands, and the way in which then you have this breakdown and reconstitution of these different ecologies. The ecology of Taiwan, the modern society, which is producing, and the woman has a kind of inability to mourn the death of her son and husband. She then encounters and meets this stranded indigenous person, and then they sort of undergo a kind of narrative where they're both trying to come to terms with mourning, one, the loss of his indigenous world through the plastic vortex and modern trash, and her, the loss of her son and husband. And the man with the compound eyes is a mysterious figure that's unclear who he is, that they encounter, who is somehow able to see the future and think the future about the possible reconciliation between these ecologies without being able to clearly articulate it. So it's almost a kind of figure of unthinkability. So with that, I'd like to sort of conclude. So I'd like to now be a bit more concrete. What would it mean that we have some duty or obligation towards trash, plastic bags? Given that I've used science fiction and folklore to at least hopefully make plausible the intelligibility of the idea, even if it's fiction. So my proposal would be this, and this is an idea that Basil and I thought about in different contexts. We couldn't figure it out, but as I said, I'm recycling it. So as you probably know, perhaps one of the most important developments in legal theory beginning in the 70s is the expansion of the category of rights and duties to non-human, non-animal entities, like forests and rivers. And here I'd like to ask the question, if we're able to expand the scope under which we have duties and obligations to entities which are neither life, so they're not animals and they're not humans, to include trees and rivers, how far can we go with that? Can we extend it to make sense of having duties and obligations that are also enforceable from a legal point of view to trash? And not just the various international conventions that already exist about the transportation of trash. I mean, there already exists international law about that. But in a sense, a duty or obligation that would respond to what I take to be what this film is about, that trash has the right not to be forgotten. And that right not to be forgotten is the right to die. To die, in a sense, with dignity, so to speak. So let me just briefly sketch how that would look like. As you probably know, one of the most important cases in this is in 2017 in New Zealand, where the Maori River Wanganui, in an area of New Zealand called Aotearoa, was given the legal status of a person, enforceable by New Zealand law. And then they had to create a new kind of institution, a guardian institution, made up of a representative of the New Zealand government and the tribe in which this river flows, called the Wanguni Iwi tribe. What's fascinating, if you look at the argument for this, is that the ascription of legal personhood to the river was not based on a Western conception of a legal entity that is a person and an individual. Instead, what the philosophers and legal scholars in New Zealand, in conjunction with Maori representatives, is they look to indigenous Maori worldviews to find a philosophical structure to then anchor a Western legal model of legal person. And here, the idea is that in the Maori worldview, as communicated and documented by representatives of the Maori tribe and scholars of Maori culture, that the river is an ancestor. So they have a very complex notion of kinship, where different Maori populations have kinship relationships not only to humans, but also to the environmental features of their world, which are understood as part of their family. And so rather than anchor and conceptualize the river as a legal person based on a kind of ethical individualism or even on capacities, it's based on what these New Zealand Maori thinkers called ethical ancestrality, and that expands the bounds of ancestralism. So the basic idea is that there is a well-being of the river, what was translated into English as the functionings of the river. And I won't go into, there's a lot of fascinating literature about why they didn't want to say this is a capabilities approach. It's not that the river has capabilities. They look to indigenous, and here I'm just quoting a term in Maori called wakapapa, which means something like a functioning, that it has to be clean, et cetera, et cetera. There's a functioning of the river, there's a functioning of human beings in their settlement, and there's a kind of reciprocity between these functionings, which has then positive duties of obligation, to use a Western vocabulary. And of course, that Western vocabulary was needed to make it legally enforceable from the New Zealand structure of law. So here, again, I don't want to suggest that trash is going to be something like a river that has the same functioning, but I find it just suggestive. Again, it's a speculative question. What prevents us from expanding the scope of ancestrality to include those things that are part of our kinship network, which are all the objects that we use, without which we wouldn't have the life that we have? They are, in their own way, they will be ancestors for the future, picking up on something that Bezo was talking about, that these microplastics, these plastic bags will last and become objects that are inherited or bequeathed as ancestors for the future for thousands and thousands of years. They also have a kind of ancestrality for us, that when we buy something that's packaged, packaging is something that obscures both what happens to this object and where it came from. The fact that plastic comes from oil that is, fossilized plants from thousands and thousands of years. So to pick up on something that Ted, argues in his book, there's a kind of memory in plastic that is completely effaced. Where did this plastic come from? Under what conditions was it produced and extracted? As well as where it will come from. So the ancestrality of the plastic, the thousands of years it took for the earth to produce fuel that then becomes plastic, and the thousands of years after, packaging obscures both the afterlife and the pre-life. We just think it's just about us. So again, I don't want to suggest that there's a well-being of trash that's the same as the well-being of plastics, but I will end with the film, that I want now to just be able for us to be disturbed and try to think through what at the end of the film the plastic asks of us as the maker, as a kind of duty or obligation. I use those words loosely. Perhaps we don't have the words to really describe it, but the end of the film, I think, is going to be a call for what we need to do vis-a-vis the bag.
I made it to the vortex. I was with my own kind. We covered an area the size of a small continent. We were free and happy. I loved going in circles, and circles, and circles. But no one here thought about anything. I grew restless, and I started to think about her again. So I spun around so fast that I was free. But I was quickly trapped. I have no idea how long ago that was. Over time, I came to like these monsters. Isn't that one beautiful? Did my maker exist, or had I created her in my mind? Why were my moments of joy so brief? And yet, like a fool, I still have hope I will meet her again. And if I do, I will tell her just one thing. I wish you had created me so that I could die.